afternoon, everyone. This is Bob Celeste from the Center for Supply Chain Studies, and welcome to Open Mic Friday. We have an interesting discussion to have today. I've told Tom that I'm a simulation aficionado. I've been doing this for quite a while, but it'll be great to share some stories and some dialogue about simulations, how they can help people in their work. If you're on the line and you'd like to participate, there's two ways you can do this. As we go through the discussion, feel free to either press the raise hand icon, and I'll be watching that, and I'll get back to you to ask your question and to talk to Tom. Or if you'd like to put in a question in the box to kind of queue that up, if I see a question in there, I'll try to unmute you and let you ask the question. If not, then I'll do my best to try to ask your question. So today we're lucky to have Tom Stephenson from Simulate Corporation, and Simulate produces a simulation software and also training around how to use simulations and the power you can get out of them. So Tom, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And also thanks for being up late. For those of you that don't know, Tom is in the UK, and it's 8 p.m. on a Friday, so we'll be sending a beer up to Tom a little later on.
Thank you. Yeah, I think our offices are actually a bit of a bar, and about an hour ago I heard the music start.
Great.
So it's not going to be too loud in the background.
So we'll have some music to go along with things. Tom, just to start off, I thought that what would be an interesting idea is I'm going to show a simulation that we've done for supply chain, and then I've asked you to show one that shows some simulation for a hospital, so we kind of get a flavor, so the audience can kind of see the kind of breadth of things you can do with simulations, so entire supply chains, or drill down to a particular area within a hospital. And then we'll have a little back and forth about your thoughts on how to use simulations and what you've seen in your career with this.
Absolutely, sounds good.
Okay, let me just switch over to a different screen here. So those of you who are watching, as long as listening, what you're seeing now is a simulation created from Simulate that we use in one of our studies, and this happens to come out of our Drug Supply Chain Security Act and blockchain study. The purpose of this simulation was to look at the supply chain and simulate it for the purposes of tracking and tracing rather products as they move through the supply chain, and to have the trading partners in the simulation exchange the data that they will have to exchange in the year 2023. So what happens in the simulation is what you're looking at right now is the inside of the manufacturer, and you see things such as product coming through, the lots coming through, product being packaged into the packages for pharmaceuticals, those packages being packed into cases, and then the cases being packed into pallets, and then those pallets being shipped. This particular simulation, and if I can manipulate this correctly here, I'll zoom out a little bit so you can see the breadth of the simulation itself. Here we go. So that was like a close look at some detailed processes within the manufacturer, and as you can see, we've also simulated what goes on within the wholesaler and the dispenser or the hospital. We've created a number of these simulations to look at the entire supply chain, all of the actors, the behavior of the actors, how they manage product, and how they manage the information that's associated with that product. This particular one that you see here, you notice that there are two other actors in this simulation. One is a criminal that's broken into the manufacturer's facility, and they've passed the product along to the second criminal who's tried now to sell it to a dispenser. The reason for this simulation in general is that as we run it, all of these processes generate data just as they would in real life. And so we push that all into a Excel spreadsheet, and just here's a look at a lot of data. And then we're able to analyze the data, because in 2023, we're not going to get this picture, and certainly not get a picture of criminal activity, but what we're going to be looking at is data, and then have to present the picture or understand the picture of what took place. So this particular simulation, what we did was we set this up. We added the turned on criminal activity. We generated a lot of data. And then the question was, in looking at this data, can we tell whether anything went on that should not have? We could also turn on mistakes in the supply chain, so we can make the manufacturer put a different serial number into a case, or we could have this wholesaler not put something into a tote, and then see what happens from the supply chain partners and from the data perspective. What I think is interesting in how we personally use simulations is that we catalog and have a library of all of our simulations and the components of them. And here's an example, just one more example of how we use those components. We had a second study that dealt with cold chain. And so we took a lot of the components out of the first simulation, and we're able to reuse them very quickly in this second simulation, which had to deal with, if we're moving product around and data around, can we also look at the temperature experience of a product as it moves through the supply chain? So this simulation uses all of the components of the previous simulation, and we've added in there temperature recording at refrigerated units, temperature recording from sensors, from indicators, from trucks that move between trading partners. And then we're also able to start to introduce problems in that respect of temperature excursions, either higher or lower than the product should have been managed at, and whether in looking at the data, we can tell that something is going wrong. So that was just something to show the audience, and also Tom, to share with you the kind of things that we do from a supply chain perspective. So just to show the power of simulations, I'd like to turn it over to you now to give us an example of a simulation that would take place within the confines of an organization.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, it's great to see all the detail that you have in that simulation, and I can see how it could be a really useful tool to be able to plan and to be able to see how the parts are likely to move through the system under different kind of circumstances. So the simulation I'm showing now, it may look and feel slightly different to the one that we saw just now, but really fundamentally it's the same idea. So rather than having a flow of parts moving through the system, in this simulation we have got patients moving through an emergency department. I'm going to run this fairly slowly to start with. So this is a fairly simplified emergency room. You know, we've got patients coming in. They're coming in on foot. We also have some emergency arrivals in the ambulances. They're being triaged, and they're going to go to one of 3 different bed types for a certain amount of time before they leave. In there, we've got staff treating the patients as well. So in the same way as the simulation you showed, we've got parts moving through a certain series of steps. They're staying a certain amount of time there. And the idea is that we are building a reflection of reality in that virtual environment. So once we've inputted all of our data to give us the sense of how the flow works in the real system, it gives us a really nice platform to be able to test changes to that system and see what the impact's going to be. A lot of the time you might already know that, for example, adding a bed is going to have a positive impact on patient waiting times. But there may be unexpected consequences of that. For example, are you just going to be moving the bottleneck to another part of the simulation now? And how is this going to work in terms of the whole system? So by having this baseline, it allows you to test a lot of different changes and really see what the impact's going to be. I'm going to kind of fast forward this to the end of the week. we get some results about the flow. So really we want the baseline to be close enough to reality so that we're confident if we make changes to this virtual model, it's going to have a similar impact in real life. So here I think the one to draw your attention to initially is that mostly the waiting time is for an ER bed. So 34% of the time, patients are waiting because there isn't an ER bed available. So what we could experiment with is by saying, well, let's add in another bed into this virtual system. I will make it 4 beds, in fact. So I'll change this to be 4. We now keep everything the same, except we have 4 beds, and we can run this through again with that change in input, have the same patients moving through, including like different variables about when they arrive through the week, because we understand that in a lot of healthcare systems, you know, patients are going to move at different rates at different times of the week. So if I run this through, now you can see that it's gone from about 34% of the time waiting for an ER bed down to 2%. So it seems as though essentially we've solved our bed block problem. The issue we've now got though is that the number of doctors is at 99% of time working. So it's, you know, probably been overworked. There's not enough doctors there to cope with the amount of patients. So we could say that increasing the amount of beds might improve our bottleneck, but only slightly, because it would then give us a shortage of doctors. Again, I could just experiment with changing my doctor's shift pattern, resetting the simulation, and running it again. So I've ran that very quickly, but now we've got a lot higher percentage of patients through the system in less than 4 hours. Our doctors aren't as highly utilized. And you can see that by playing around with the system, we've managed to get a better flow for the patients. And although this is a bit of a simplified simulation, hopefully that gives a feel for how you could take a baseline and play around with certain variables and see what the impact's likely to be in real life in a real kind of risk-free environment. Does that give you enough of a kind of overview of how these might work? Do you have any questions on that?
Yeah, and so this is interesting. So using this as sort of a baseline structure, you can overlay this over a real, let's say, chart of a hospital where things really are, and start to look at even more detail in how far away are areas. So there's a lot you can add into this beyond what you're doing here. This is a good start for understanding patient flow and the use of resources.
Absolutely. I mean, you can test anything that you want with these. This is just one example where you can test resources, but you know, we've got different shift patterns. We have people testing things like just changing the amount of reception areas they have, or changing spaces in the waiting room, you know, streaming patients different ways, positioning things in different places. You can really test any changes that you want. And going back to the other part of the question, by overlaying it onto a kind of almost a floor plan. A lot of hospitals actually like to use a floor plan for this because it just makes it instantly relatable to anybody who's looking at it. You can see this and it resonates with the real system that you work in, and you know, you see the queue building up at a certain time of day, and that works just like reality. Then I think it increases a bit of engagement, and it steers you into testing things that you might want to test, and just increases that understanding, really.
Yeah, I noticed that. So one of the things that I've noticed in some of the things that we've done, and actually what I demonstrate, that criminal activity, certainly that's not something that you would test in real life. You know, we would never say, okay, we're going to let a criminal loose in your environment. And the same thing here, where maybe you're testing what happens in an emergency, or kind of talk about different scenarios of emergencies that might stress the hospital at certain points, not as the sort of day-to-day work, but what happens if there is something that takes place? How does that stress what we have going on in the hospital?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that because I mean right now we're working with a hospital in Seattle on the West Coast, and what they're looking at is they're looking at preparing for mass casualty events,
Mm.
and they're able to test so many different scenarios, such as what time does the event occur? If it occurs at this time, are we going to have less staff on? So do we need to rush them in quickly? How does this differ if it was, say, a mass shooting compared to, I guess it could be anything, a rail crash, anything that brings in mass casualties. We've tested that, and we've done similar things in the Middle East as well, in Qatar, looking at blood donation centers, and seeing that preparing not only for the general amount of blood donations, but seeing how that would hold up if you had something where there was a lot of casualties and you have a lot of extra people coming into the system, because it is a problem. I mean, things like death rates you're gonna have a good idea of how they work, but that's going to be quite different if you can't get patients who need surgery into a surgery because there's so many people arriving.
Yeah, I think that's interesting. So you, based on your scenarios of, let's say, emergencies that you're planning for, they may take different resources up, as you're talking about, mass shootings, or maybe a large influenza outbreak or something like that might stress different places within the hospital, or any not only we're using hospital as an example here, but this could be any kind of environment that you're trying to do some what if testing with.
Yeah, definitely. I think any kind of healthcare environment, there are going to be spikes in demand. There are going to be peaks and troughs, and preparing for that on a day-to-day basis can be challenging enough because, for example, primary care, we know that in primary care you're going to have more pressure on the system at certain times of the year, even when you include things like seasonality. So just preparing for that can be quite a useful kind of method of doing simulation. But then when you're talking about these major events, that adds a different element to it as well. We've looked at this on, even in terms of weather, we've looked at this recently. We're working with a hospital, I forget exactly where the site is. I'll have to follow up with that. They're near Texas, and they have hurricanes, so they wanted to plan how many aircraft they actually need to evacuate all their patients in enough time before the storm hits.
So I wonder if you can take data from real events and sort of play them back through the simulation to see how a setup would have reacted to it.
Yeah. I mean, the first thing that we always would do is look for any past data that we can populate a simulation with. We'd want to set the baseline by looking at either the closest time period that you've got. So imagine the last 3 months, or if you've got a seasonal flow, we would populate it with data that is, from the previous year, or however we predict the simulation is going to work. We would want to populate it with any past data that we can. And if you haven't got that data, it shouldn't really act as a block immediately, because you can always speak to people involved in the process as well, and sort of fill in the gaps as best you can by talking to those people who know the system, which often gives you a very good baseline, even without full data.
Okay, I want to get back to talking about how people kind of experience the simulation process in their environment. But first, we've got Matt on the line that has he's got a huge question here. Matt, are you on?
Yeah, I'm here. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. Yeah. I just unloaded a pool of questions as you were talking. So forgive me if there's if there are too many. But no, one of the questions I had was in terms of your tool, like many other types of discrete event simulation tools, I'm assuming that I have the ability as a user to specify the arrival distributions and service time distributions.
Yes, absolutely. So what you do is you take the past data and you see what that variation looks like. We've actually got a plugin called StatFit where you can just input all your data range and it gives you advice on which distribution is best to use. So for any building block or inter-arrival time, you can input some distributions that are going to make sure that the simulation matches reality. Often we want to be quite dynamic with that distribution as well, if we know that it's going to change over time.
So I have, okay, so for example, if I have collected data, you guys can determine whether it fits, like, say, a Poisson distribution or a gamma distribution. And,
Exactly.
okay, and then can I also just create my own distribution?
Yes, yes. So we call that a probability profile in Simulate. And what you're doing is just saying, well, what is the percentage that fall within a certain value? So imagine it as a frequency distribution, and you can create them. I normally use direct links with Microsoft Excel because you can just copy and paste your data as long as it's in the right format, and that will give you your own distribution. I tend to use those, my own distributions, when maybe there's something quite strange in the data that means it doesn't fit a distribution fully. So, for example, in the UK, we have a 4-hour wait target. And what you find is that as you get to sort of 3 hours and 50, there's a lot of patients who get through the system in exactly that 3 hours 50. And then just over 4 hours, there's a steep drop off. Because people need to make that target, so they'll often change things in the system to do as well as they can on that government controlled target. But when you've got all that data, it doesn't always fit a pattern, in which case creating your own distribution is a good way forward.
Okay, yeah. Well, that was going to be my next question too, because I want to know if so. It sounds like you have the ability to specify your queue lengths for each station in the simulation.
Yeah, as in the length of queue, was that, sorry?
Right, yeah, for the queue length at each station and the distribution. So for example, if I'm doing manufacturing, I
Yeah.
want to make sure I know what my work in process is at each station. So I might have to cap that in order to control the flow of product through the system. And
Yeah.
similarly in the hospital too. So
Yeah, so I mean, often, most of the time, the queues, people won't put a limit on them, but absolutely that's an option. So one of the built-in options that we've got is to put a limit on the queue so that it mirrors reality. Other things we can do quite easily are like setting a shelf life on the queue, which would mean that if you wait a certain amount of time and still aren't seen, then you're likely to just leave the system. So this might apply to an emergency room. If you come in and your illness isn't that bad and you're waiting a long time, you might decide to leave. Or a call center, if you call and you're on hold for a lot of time, you might say, well, I can't be bothered to wait 30 minutes, I'm going to hang up. That's another setting that we have. A final one is you can actually force people to stay in a queue for a certain amount of time as well. In manufacturing, that might be if you're waiting for paint to dry or a block of metal to cool down. In healthcare, it tends to be if you have to stay in the system to be monitored for a certain amount of time. For example, if you give blood and after you give blood, you have to sit and just be monitored for a certain amount of time, but you're not taking any capacity away from the system.
I see, okay. And getting back to the distributions, so can you, do you have control over the random number generation?
Yes, so the software will automatically assign a random number, which stays throughout all the simulation runs that you do. We don't want to change that random number when we're experimenting, because we want to make sure that the difference in any results is because of the change we've made rather than the random number changing. But you do have control to be able to change that random number. And if you run a trial, which is where we do say 100 runs and then take an average, it will use a different random number stream every time.
Okay, great. Okay.
Tom, do you mind taking a question from another? We have another person on the line. Is
Not at all.
It's Kelly? Thanks, Matt. Hi, Kelly.
Hello.
You're on.
All right. So I just had a general question. So let's say that we were able to actually pull information on specific data elements. Would we be able to pull that information in as like an integration or as a feed of data to automatically get this to run? How would that work?
Yeah, a lot of people generally would take data from a database and integrate it to a simulation via a CSV or an Excel file, just because that's an easy way to integrate with the simulation. But within Simulate, we do actually have the ability to pull directly from a database using SQL queries. So if you have people with the skill to set that up, you can have the simulation respond to new data. And we've actually had some grants recently to kind of test the feasibility of doing that in the UK, looking at seeing from near real-time data how you might make changes at the start of the day based on what you have seen is coming in from your database, but also what you then predict is going to happen going forward.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, Tom, we because we're doing some more supply chain simulations, we've had times where maybe there's a supply chain partner that's not available, and so we've pushed data out of the simulation and into real systems, test systems, of course, but real ones.
Yeah. So you kind of push data the other way out into the system.
Right. So we could take any of the trading partners and remove them from the simulation and connect them to the trading partner's system, if you will, and either push data to them or pull in data of a certain format.
Yeah, it's great to be able to do that. I can imagine that's very powerful to have the link between the two.
Mm-hmm. And we have, let's see, Stacy. Let me see if I could get you. Hi, Stacy. Maybe I waited too. Stacy? Oh, Stacy wanted to see a few more examples. So we may be able to pull some examples. I know that we only had a couple that we teed up for today on this, but in other, so we've shown patient flow, we've shown product flow, information flow, and I know that you're also able through the tool to be able to assign financial variables to all of the timing and all of the events. So you can take a look at what does this scenario cost us, and then make some alterations like you did before, adding staff or adding beds or adding space, rerun it and take a look at what that means from a financial perspective.
Yeah, I think there's a key financial element in there, absolutely. I mean, we work across all different kinds of simulation in healthcare. Emergency rooms are, a common problem to look at, but things like surgery, even things like, say, the amount of porters or moving patients around the hospital, it's quite a big use case. Other than that, there's things, we'll work a lot with pharmaceutical companies as well, who might want to see the impact of a new drug or medical device on a whole healthcare system, on a whole population. So we've got loads of different examples actually, and maybe as a follow-up we can send a link to our website where you can see some of these live. And I'll also be happy to follow up personally if you want to connect afterwards.
Sure.
And that's
Yeah,
great.
I'll put them up on the site.
Great.
So from a user experience, I've often been asked, well, can't you do the same thing with a spreadsheet? But how do you find when you're working with people this kind of approach where you're actually purporting to show at least what they're actually doing, and they could get some feedback? Do you get better feedback from people because they're able to visualize their work?
Yeah, I think absolutely. When you show people an Excel file, it is, you often come out with the correct answer, or an answer that's very similar. But I think you've hit the nail on the head when you talked about the visual element adding understanding. If you can see your flow, then that's really, I find people engage with that quite a lot. So if you take a simulation to a meeting, you'll often have a lot of different questions about, oh, could we try this? Could we do things slightly differently? And the engagement from the room I found to be quite a little bit higher when showing a simulation. I guess the other thing with it is it's quite a novel approach for a lot of people. So a lot of people won't have seen anything like this before, which can give a bit of a wow factor as well, especially if people are used to seeing 10-page Word documents or big Excel files where it's maybe a little harder to understand what's going on with them when you can't see that kind of flow.
Yeah, and do you often find that, so example like this where you're getting together, you're needing to get together a number of departments or people that may assume that they understand how the other person's working or how the other process works, but when you start to actually visualize it and and they're in the room together talking about it, how's that work out with folks?
Yeah, it's I guess it could vary quite a lot, because what you'd find is that people often do know their part of the system very, very well. But what they often might not understand fully is how that has a knock-on impact to other areas of the system. So I think there's a lot of examples where people might even change things in the way that they work to make sure their system is slightly better. We've seen examples like, for example, a nurse holding a bed because they know a patient is coming in that's going to need it soon, which is great for their area of the hospital. But when they look at the knock-on impact, it might not be great for everything. We've had other things as well, like for example, if things are getting tagged, like we might have wheelchairs tagged with Wi-Fi and things like that to monitor where they are, and you'll find that often people will do things to make it seem as though that system isn't how the data is showing. It might be things like putting weight on a bed so that it looks like it's being taken. We have seen things like that. The other thing that we might see as well is, say if we input the data, we've had it before where we've input all the data and we've said, oh no, what's going wrong here? It's just not working how the data is showing it. We're seeing much bigger blocks here than is reality. Like, what are we doing wrong? And actually, when you speak to people in the system, they might know that in reality, things do happen that way, but just the way that data gets recorded and things like that gives you a slightly skewed picture. But yeah, I think generally people do know the system well, and that they are working very well in their particular area, which allows you to really give good advice and make good changes to a simulation. But then sometimes understanding that knock-on impact can be quite tough.
Interesting. I always relate this one simulation exercise we were doing. We had manufacturers, wholesalers, and hospitals people in the room, and the wholesaler person left the room, and we were making some changes in the manufacturer's area, and we were just about ready to run it when the wholesaler came back in the room, and we did that. we started to run it, and what was happening was that the product was moving into the wholesaler environment, and then it was moving into quarantine. And I could feel him coming over my back because he was looking at the simulation and seeing all of his product moving into quarantine. And he said, "What's going on here?" So we stopped the simulation, we ran the analytics on it, and came back and said, "Well, it was this change that we made over here. That's what it was." And I remember him saying, "You see that? That manufacturer didn't tell us he was going to do that." It was very visceral because it was, almost gamification, if you will, of what we were working on. It wasn't just a cold spreadsheet.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I mean, one that it didn't happen to me personally, but one of our other consultants had, that was quite interesting, was he was working in a car plant. This was a few years ago, quite a number of years ago now, and basically there was one man who controlled a lot of the flow. He said, yeah, this one goes this way, and he was about to leave the company, and they wanted to see how they can replace him, basically. And they found that when they'd replaced him with somebody else, they maybe weren't working as well because they didn't have all the experience. So what they did as a test was they built a simulation that mirrored the real system, and they said, stop the simulation at certain times and said, okay, what would you do in this situation? They said, okay, I'll put the car this side. And they kept going through this, and actually when he was sitting there with the simulation, he was performing so well, but in reality it wasn't like that. And he said, well, that's because I can see in the simulation, I can see what's happening everywhere. So the solution they came up with was they just installed cameras in the manufacturing line. So then he could see it in the real system, and without having to change anything about how the flow worked, they could actually improve the reality.
Ah, so it was literally a visibility issue that.
Yeah, but that's something that you get from a simulation, is you get to have that visual element.
Mm-hmm. So as people start to use simulations, I guess there must be a method, if you will, for how you determine, or some ideas you may have as around how do you determine whether a project would be good for a simulation?
Yeah, that's a good question. Because the thing is, there's so many different analytical tools that you can use, especially today, where there's all different ways of solving a problem.
Mm-hmm.
I think really whenever there's a flow that you want to improve, that's where being able to map out the flow is really useful in a simulation. I think what you find a lot of the time when you're mapping out the flow is that you can often solve the problem before you've even really got in all of the detail into the simulation. So anywhere where there's a bottleneck or a flow or queues building up, that really lends itself to a simulation. The other thing is when there's quite a lot of complexity in the system. So say a whole healthcare area. In the UK, we have clinical commissioning groups who commission healthcare for a whole area, and that's a really complex question because you've got a lot of different services all interacting with each other, and you've got changing patient demographics. So to be able to solve that kind of problem without using any sort of mapping tool and being able to see the steps in the system and understand how the flows link together, I think that's when simulation's useful. So obviously in a hospital there's so much complexity like that, which until you sit down and actually map it out into a simulation might be hard to make any kind of reasonable changes to.
Mm-hmm. I have Matt has another question about hey Matt.
Yeah, hi. Yeah, well, I had several questions.
That's okay.
But you tell me when to stop, Bob.
All right, go ahead.
In terms of what we're seeing right now, this kind of simulation with all the graphics, how long would it take to build something like this with your tool?
So it really depends on how detailed you want to go, and how much artistic talent you have. It's not really a technical skill to be able to do this. For example, a lot of this background is just a background image of which the patients are flowing over. So we do a lot with the simulation to make it easy to change anything. I'm not sure if my screen's still showing, but you can click on any of the objects, and we've got graphical properties to do with them where you can change them, and there's a whole library of images that Simulate have that make it quicker and easier for you. I mean, with something like this, it might take maybe 2 or 3 hours to build something like this. But I think generally to get something that's understandable and relatable compared to just the steps in a process, you can do it very quickly. There's a few simple things like adding a background, especially if, say, you've got a floor plan of your hospital. If you just drop that floor plan on and move the building blocks in line with that, you can do that fairly quickly. I mean, certain clients, like some of our pharmaceutical clients who want to take the simulation out and they want it to be a sales tool whereby they can use it with a lot of different hospitals, they might put a bit more time into it, and they might spend a couple of days making the graphics look nice. But I normally don't like to spend more than a couple of hours on it.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any kind of like templates that people can work from instead of starting from scratch?
So, I mean, this one right here is kind of a template. This is an example file. We've got a whole library of images that people can use, and there's different types of images. So in like healthcare, we've got a whole library of all different. If I come into manufacturing, let's say, I'll have a lot of different options here that will hopefully reflect something like the real system. If not, you might have to kind of create your own. Is an option. We can take any image file that you want, but we have enough there to be able to build very powerful displays.
And so this is all web-based, or is the tool also available as a host-based tool?
Yeah, it's quite good that you mentioned this, because it is actually desktop-based. The main tool is desktop-based, but we're really proud to actually be the first simulation company to release an online simulation, and that's in a beta stage just now. We actually released that at the start of the week, so you can build simulations completely online now. I don't know if you've had a chance to test that, Bob, at all, but it really does work like the real simulations. Like the desktop version, it's not slow. All the features are there, and that avoids a lot of the kind of installation issues you might have, and things like that. But a lot of people will still, we think, prefer to work in a desktop environment and install the software on the machine. But we do have both options available now.
Okay, great. And another one of my questions was in terms of licenses. So if I'm at a university, so and we actually have courses in simulation,
Right.
but we also do R&D. In fact, we're working on a project very similar to this with our hospital at the university. Yeah. So do you have like special licenses for university environments?
Yes, we do. Yes. Really, for us, if educational establishments are using the tool, it's great. So we've got a student edition. We've also got some. We've worked with a lot of universities, so we've got some materials that can be used and things like that as well. We obviously make it free to all the students as well. So yeah, I'll be happy if you want to follow up afterwards. We'll be happy to set you up with any kind of test, or if you wanted to have it in your university, we'd be happy to take that offline.
Yeah, I would. Yeah, definitely. And then another question, if I may. So given that there's many simulation packages out there, how does your package differ than some of the others that are out there?
Yeah, so there are a few different ones out there. Each of them have their own strengths. For us, the main focus that we have is being able to get to your results and make changes quickly. So you don't need to be able to use code to build in Simulate. We've got a very simple and quick drag and drop that allows you to pull building blocks on the screen. And also the run speed, we think, is very quick compared to competitors. So that's really one of our main kind of selling points. Quick to build, easy to learn, but still with all of the power. I think some competitors maybe have more of a focus on 3D animation, or I think even they're testing things like VR and things like that as well, which is it's pretty cool. But to do a project with that takes a lot of time and a lot of cost. So our focus is always about making it easy for people to pick up the software, use it, get results, and make change without losing any of the power that you might get with any competitors.
And I've noticed that with I call our simulations kind of ugly simulations, because we don't use any of the prettiness of it, because there's a lot in the background that's going on.
Yeah.
And I think I feel bad. Sometimes I think the folks from Simulate may cringe when they see ours.
Not at all. No, I think it's it's still good to see the flow laid out, and it's still very powerful. I'm sure there's a lot of detail that goes into them as well. Yeah, I think the other thing that maybe sets us apart from competitors is our stamp on the healthcare market. So a lot of the features that have came into the software in recent years have been healthcare focused, because we've got a real big user base of healthcare users. So we try and make the software easier for our users. Every year or every few months we have a new release. And I think in terms of the healthcare sector, we've also built a lot of tools as well. So we've got a bed management tool, we've got a whole system healthcare tool, and that's just because of all of our experience in that area.
Tom, from a point of view of once you've built a simulation and you've solved the particular problem, and in the case that you just showed us, I think what was interesting was, as you started to make changes, of course, the bottleneck moved around.
Yeah.
So, it may take a number of iterations to understand where you're comfortable with the bottleneck being. There'll always be one.
Yeah.
But also to not over-optimize a particular area. I think that was interesting. What you demonstrated there was, the fact that you can be focused on something. At one point, you were focused on beds, the number of beds, and of course that affected the doctors and so on.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting because I mean, the other thing you've got what may be technically the right answer may not work because of things like compassionate reasons, having space for families and things like that. We maybe don't want to increase our beds too much. But what I tend to do is, when I go into any project, I always think, well, what problem am I trying to solve, first of all? And that helps you keep it refined. What problem am I trying to solve? And then think, well, if I've got this problem, what possible ways could I solve that problem or make that problem better? And that's where you'd have a bit of a an ideas session. And then the third thing is about testing all of them, testing a lot of different things and learning as you test them about how the simulation or how the real system might respond. And those 3 steps I find quite key to narrowing in on using a simulation effectively to solve problems.
I think that's interesting because, if you think about the environment that you're in, and you have a number of people from different parts of the organization, if we're talking about an organization or the supply chain, the fact that people may come up with different ways of solving something, and rather than what typically happens, which is the loudest person or the person with the most authority wins the day, you can pretty quickly take them all and say, let's just test them all and see what happens, because you just don't know sometimes who really has the best idea.
Exactly, and I mean, you can test things that there's no way you could ever test them in real life, because the risk would be too extreme. But yeah, that's the thing. You can easily manage people with the simulation and say, yeah, sounds like a great idea, let me run it through. And it might be great, and you might be able to say, fantastic idea, it's improved waiting time by X, or it might be that this is great, but if we do this, it's going to push the problem to elsewhere. That kind of thing is the way the simulation can help with those conversations.
Yeah, and then do you see people using this also as a training tool? So once you've come to some sort of agreement on a process or how things should be, that you've kind of blueprinted it to some extent, and now as you kind of roll it out to reality, to real life, can you use this as a training tool?
Yeah, I mean, there's no reason you couldn't use it as a training tool to be able to show the impact of making any changes. What we find actually is generally the healthcare organizations that use it as a training tool tend to use very simple models. And that might be to show very simple ideas, or ideas that seem very simple, but people struggle with. Things like why you need to account for variation in a healthcare system, and why planning on an average won't actually work. That kind of concept works really well for smaller kind of teaching models.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and even if for like a new employee, just how does our business work?
Yeah,
might be an interesting thing.
Yeah, it'd be interesting to see that, and I can see that it could work really well. I've not had many people use it for like training new starts or things like that, but I can certainly see how it could apply.
Tom, I'm going to take back the control. I have a question from Bruce, who's on the call, but I can't open up his mic. He just asked if I could explain a little bit about the simulation that I showed. Do you mind that?
Sure.
Okay. Let me just change. Let's see if I've got the right screen showing here. Let me go to the original one. So Bruce, and for everyone that's watching, the purpose of this particular simulation was that training partners need to collect certain information as they process the product. So in the manufacturer's case, and I'll try and zoom in here. If I go the right way, here we go. So in the manufacturer's case, as product is being built, and you see here product assigned the lot number, fill the bottles. So these are right now you see M001 product 01 bottle filling. So that's a bottle that doesn't have a label on it. It's filled. You may not do it this way, but this is what we're demonstrating. We fill the bottle, bottles come down, and they're assigned. They're actually assigned and printed the barcode on the bottle. And so what happens when that takes place, when a product moves from this filled bottles to being essentially labeled, is that it sends out into the manufacturer's area a piece of data. And so this is the manufacturer's data. You could say this, I know this is gonna, let me zoom in a little bit. This is kind of an eye chart, isn't it? This line number 16 is creating a commissioning event, and this is the kind of data that's being captured on that bottle. You see there, it says URN EPC right here. That's the actual identifier for that bottle, and it's being commissioned. So now we've captured that in the manufacturer's area. As we move through the process, so now the bottle's been identified, and now it goes into packaging, and it, let's see, where is the, down in this area down here. Let me see if I can highlight this. Down here, the case is being created, and then the bottles are put into the case. I know this is might be an eye chart, right in this area here. And then that moves on to the pallets and also, but then at the shipping event, which is way down here in the manufacturer, at that point, the manufacturer records the shipping event. It goes into the database that I just showed you, but it also sends certain information to their trading partner, the wholesaler, and we also capture that. So in this shipping event, this little icon here, there's a lot that goes on behind the scenes on this one. There's a lot of code that goes in here. I'll just expose it just for. There it is. I don't know if I can. Let's see if I have any code in here. So all the decisions that the manufacturer has to make and the information that they send is kind of captured in this. We're using a lot of code here because we really are bending the simulation package to do the not only product flow, information flow, but also behavior of the trading partners as they exchange information and products. And so there's quite a bit going on, even though this just looks like a static picture, a lot that's going on that we're trying to track. And then we're trying to do some what if analysis. And now we'll start to go in here and turn things on and off. So errors that can occur, someone put the wrong bottle in a package, we can make that happen in the simulation, run it, and see if the trading partner what happens when the trading partner opens up that case and the wrong serial number is in there, for example. Or something is removed from the manufacturer's inventory and it shows up somewhere else in the supply chain. So those are the kind of things we're trying to simulate. So I hope that helps, Bruce, a little bit. If you'd like, we can talk offline on how it's working and the kind of things we're doing. So Tom, we're up at the top of our hour. Really, I could go on and on talking to you about this, and I think there are a couple people that are on the line also, because this is as close to reality I think you get. If you think about, we live in a kind of PowerPoint world, and just because you draw a line between two things in PowerPoint doesn't mean it's actually going to work. This gets you just that much closer before you really commit the large dollars to change.
Yeah, absolutely. I think you've summarized it really well there. I just want to say thanks for having me on again. Thanks everybody for listening. It's been interesting talking to you today. And if any of you want to follow up with me afterwards, hopefully we can provide my email address and some links and things like that. And you want to connect on LinkedIn, it's Tom Stephenson. I guess if you just do Tom Stephenson Simulate, I'll pop up. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Tom. And so we'll poll the audience too. We'd like to have you back on. We are thinking about putting together a simulation interest group within our community. So I think we'll see more as we go along with this. And thanks also for staying up on a late Friday night. Go have your beer and have a great weekend.
Thank you. Have a great weekend too.
All right. Thanks everyone for joining today. And we'll post the recording on our site.